July 1940. Europe had fallen with shocking speed. In less than a year, Nazi Germany had shattered the balance of power that had existed since the end of the First World War. One by one, nations that once believed themselves secure collapsed before the relentless force of the German war machine. It began in September 1939 with the invasion of Poland. The attack came with a new style of warfare the world had never truly witnessed before. Fast-moving armored divisions, supported by dive bombers and mechanized infantry, tore through defensive lines in days rather than months. Poland fought fiercely, but within weeks the country was crushed between Germany in the west and the Soviet Union in the east. For several months after Poland's defeat, Western Europe entered what journalists called the phony war. Britain and France had declared war on Germany, yet the front lines remained mostly silent. Many hoped the conflict might still be contained. But Adolf Hitler had no intention of waiting. In April 1940, German forces struck north. Denmark surrendered in a single day. Norway fought longer, but German troops captured Oslo and secured the coastline that would protect vital iron ore shipments from Sweden. The message was clear. Germany was not merely fighting a war, it was reshaping the map of Europe. Then came the offensive that stunned the world. On May 10, 1940, German forces launched a massive attack against the Low Countries and France. The Netherlands and Belgium had expected an assault, but they believed their defenses, combined with Allied armies, would slow the Germans down. Instead, German armored columns pushed through the dense forests of the Ardennes, terrain the French High Command had considered nearly impossible for tanks. The gamble worked. Within days, German panzer divisions burst through French lines and raced toward the English Channel. Allied armies advancing into Belgium suddenly found themselves trapped. Hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers were forced into a desperate evacuation from the beaches of Dunkirk. It was a moment that seemed to confirm Germany's unstoppable momentum. Although over 300,000 Allied troops escaped across the Channel, they left behind most of their heavy equipment. To many observers, Britain's army had barely survived destruction. Meanwhile, the German advance continued. Paris fell on June 14th. Just days later, France, one of the most powerful military nations in Europe, requested an armistice. The agreement was signed in June 22, 1940, in the same railway carriage where Germany had surrendered at the end of the First World War. For Hitler, the symbolism was deliberate. In less than 6 weeks, the French Republic had collapsed. Across Europe, the shock was immense. Governments that had once relied on French military strength suddenly faced a new reality. Germany now dominated the continent from the Atlantic coast to the borders of the Soviet Union. Only one major power remained in the fight. Across the English Channel stood Great Britain. From Berlin's perspective, the situation seemed obvious. France was defeated. Much of Europe was either occupied or aligned with Germany. The British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped annihilation at Dunkirk and had lost most of its weapons. To many German leaders, Britain's position looked hopeless. Even Hitler himself believed the British government would soon recognize the reality of the situation. He had long admired the British Empire and imagined that Germany and Britain might one day coexist as dominant powers. Germany controlling continental Europe, Britain maintaining its vast overseas empire. But for that to happen, the war had to end. During the weeks after France's surrender, Hitler repeatedly signaled that he was open to peace. Through speeches and diplomatic channels, he suggested that Germany had no desire to destroy Britain. Instead, he implied that a negotiated settlement could preserve stability in Europe. Inside the German leadership, many expected that such an agreement would arrive soon. After all, Britain now stood alone. On the British side of the Channel, however, something very different was unfolding. In May 1940, as German armies surged through France, Britain had chosen a new prime minister,
a man known for his stubborn determination and refusal to compromise with Nazi Germany. Winston Churchill. In his first speeches to Parliament, Churchill made Britain's position unmistakably clear. There would be no negotiations, no surrender. The country would fight on, regardless of the cost. But in Germany, many still doubted that Britain could truly continue the war. Throughout June and early July, German intelligence attempted to assess Britain's strength. Reports suggested British forces were scrambling to rebuild their army, mobilizing civilians, and preparing defenses along the southern coast. To Hitler, it seemed unlikely that Britain would willingly endure a prolonged conflict against a continent now dominated by Germany. Surely, he believed, reason would prevail. High in the Bavarian Alps stood the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat overlooking the dramatic peaks near Berchtesgaden. It was here, surrounded by sweeping views and carefully controlled privacy, that many strategic discussions took place. In July 1940, after the stunning victories in Western Europe, Hitler summoned his top military leaders: Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, General Alfred Jodl, Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, General Franz Halder. The expectation was simple. The war in the West was essentially finished. Now the question was how Britain would end its resistance and under what terms peace might be arranged. But as the generals arrived and the reports were placed on the table, a troubling picture began to emerge. Britain was not preparing to surrender. Instead, intelligence suggested the opposite. Aircraft production was increasing, coastal defenses were expanding, the Royal Navy remained the most powerful fleet in the world, and Churchill's speeches were igniting a wave of determination across the British population. The assumption that Britain would collapse after France had proven dangerously optimistic. Inside the conference room at the Berghof, the mood slowly shifted. The discussion that day would force Hitler and his commanders to confront a possibility they had hoped to avoid. If Britain refused peace, Germany faced a problem unlike any it had encountered so far in the war: an island nation protected by the sea, a navy Germany could not easily defeat, and a government that had already decided it would fight to the very end.
July 1940. High in the Bavarian Alps, the Berghof stood quiet beneath a bright summer sky. From the terraces of the mountain retreat, the view stretched for miles across forests and distant peaks. It was a place where Adolf Hitler often received his closest advisors, far from the noise of Berlin. Only weeks earlier, the German leader had stood at the height of his power. France had collapsed with stunning speed. German armies controlled most of Western Europe. The victories had been so decisive that many in the German leadership believed the war in the West was already over. Now, only Britain remained. Hitler believed the situation was simple. Britain had lost its main ally on the continent. Its army had barely escaped from Dunkirk. Its position appeared weak and isolated. Under these circumstances, it seemed logical that the British government would seek a negotiated peace. That expectation shaped the meeting now taking place at the Berghof. Around the large map table stood several of Germany's most powerful military figures: Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Armed Forces High Command; General Alfred Jodl, responsible for operational planning; Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe and one of Hitler's most trusted associates; Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, head of the German Navy; and General Franz Halder, chief of staff of the German army. Each man had participated in the planning that brought Germany its victories. But this meeting was not about another lightning campaign across the continent. It was about Britain. Folders of intelligence reports had been delivered from Berlin. Reconnaissance photographs, intercepted communications, naval assessments, and diplomatic updates all pointed to the same troubling conclusion: Britain was not asking for peace.
Hitler listened as the reports were summarized. The British government under Winston Churchill had rejected any possibility of negotiation. In speeches broadcast across the world, Churchill insisted that Britain would continue the fight regardless of the consequences. To many German officials, this seemed irrational. From their perspective, Britain had already lost the war on the continent. The idea that it could stand alone against the power of Germany appeared unrealistic. But the intelligence reports suggested that Britain was preparing for exactly that. Aircraft factories across the country were working at full capacity. Fighter planes were leaving assembly lines faster than German planners had expected. Airfields were expanding, radar stations were being reinforced, and new fighter squadrons were forming. Even more concerning was the situation at sea. The Royal Navy remained the largest and most experienced naval force in the world. Its ships controlled the waters around the British Isles, making any invasion attempt extremely dangerous. Grand Admiral Raeder knew this reality better than anyone in the room. Germany's navy had performed effectively during operations in Norway, but it had suffered losses. Several destroyers had been sunk, and the fleet was far smaller than Britain's. In a direct confrontation, the German navy would face overwhelming opposition. For years, German naval strategy had assumed that Britain would eventually become an enemy, but the navy had never been fully prepared for a massive cross-channel invasion. As the meeting continued, the tone grew increasingly serious. General Halder described the condition of the German army after the French campaign. The troops were victorious, but tired. Equipment needed maintenance. Divisions required time to reorganize after weeks of rapid movement and combat. Launching another major operation immediately would be risky. Still, some in the room believed Britain could be forced to surrender without an invasion. Hermann Göring, confident and outspoken, argued that the Luftwaffe could solve the problem from the air. German bombers and fighters had dominated the skies over France. Göring believed they could do the same over Britain. If the Royal Air Force were destroyed, he argued, Britain would be defenseless. Without air protection, its cities, ports, and factories could be bombed into submission. The British government would eventually have no choice but to negotiate. Hitler listened carefully. At this stage, he still preferred a political solution. A peace agreement would allow Germany to consolidate its power in Europe and avoid a prolonged conflict. But the intelligence reports kept returning to the same conclusion. Britain showed no signs of weakening. In fact, public morale appeared to be strengthening. Churchill's speeches were being broadcast repeatedly, encouraging resistance. Volunteers were joining defense units across the country. Coastal areas were being fortified in preparation for a possible invasion. From London's perspective, the war had entered a new phase. Britain was preparing to stand alone. For Adolf Hitler, this was difficult to understand. He had expected British leadership to act pragmatically, to recognize the strategic reality after France's defeat. Instead, the British government seemed determined to continue the war indefinitely. Inside the Berghof conference room, the maps on the table showed the narrow stretch of water separating occupied Europe from the British Isles, the English Channel. Only about 30 kilometers at its narrowest point, yet protected by powerful naval forces and unpredictable weather. For centuries, that stretch of water had served as Britain's natural defense. Now it stood between Germany and complete victory in the West. As the meeting progressed, the generals began to discuss a possibility that only weeks earlier seemed unnecessary. If Britain refused peace, Germany might have to invade the island. The concept had already received a name in German planning circles. An operation that would require thousands of ships, massive air superiority, and the coordination of Army, Navy, and Air Force on an unprecedented scale. But even as the idea was raised, doubts filled the room. Because defeating Britain would not resemble the campaigns in Poland, Norway, or France.
This would be something far more dangerous: an invasion across open water against a nation whose navy still ruled the seas. And for the first time since the war began, the German leadership was forced to confront a troubling possibility. Victory might not come quickly, and Britain might not break at all.
The conversation at the Berghof gradually shifted from expectation to necessity. If Britain refused peace, Germany would have to consider forcing the issue. What had once seemed unthinkable was now placed on the table as a real strategic option: an invasion of Britain. Within the German command structure, the proposed operation had already been given a name: Operation Sea Lion. The concept was simple in theory, but extraordinarily complex in reality. German forces would cross the English Channel, land along the southern coast of England, establish beachheads, and push inland toward London. If successful, it would eliminate Britain as a base of resistance and end the war in the West. But theory and reality were very different things. Inside the conference room, the maps of the Channel region were spread across the large table. Red and blue markings showed possible landing zones, naval routes, and defensive positions. The narrow strip of water between France and England looked deceptively small on paper. In practice, it was one of the most heavily defended maritime regions in the world. Adolf Hitler listened as each branch of the German military presented its perspective. For the army, represented by Franz Halder, the question was whether enough troops and equipment could be transported quickly enough to establish a secure foothold. German planners estimated that several divisions would need to land during the first wave alone. Thousands of soldiers, tanks, artillery pieces, trucks, ammunition, and supplies would have to cross the Channel within hours. But the German army had almost no experience with large amphibious operations. Unlike Britain, Germany had never built specialized landing craft on a significant scale. Instead, planners began examining alternative solutions: river barges, converted cargo vessels, and small transport ships gathered from ports across occupied Europe. It was a massive logistical improvisation. Then came the naval assessment. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder spoke with the cautious tone of someone who understood the risks all too well. The German Navy had already suffered losses during the Norwegian campaign earlier in 1940. Several destroyers had been sunk, and the fleet remained significantly smaller than Britain's. Across the Channel stood the Royal Navy, the most powerful naval force on Earth. If British battleships and cruisers reached the invasion routes, they could devastate the slow-moving transport barges carrying German troops. Raeder explained that without complete control of the air above the Channel, the invasion would be extremely dangerous. German ships alone could not guarantee protection against British naval intervention. That responsibility, he suggested, would fall to the Luftwaffe. At this point, Hermann Göring leaned forward confidently. As head of the German Air Force, he had watched his aircraft dominate the skies over Poland, Norway, Belgium, and France. To him, the solution was obvious. Before any invasion could occur, the Luftwaffe would destroy the Royal Air Force. German bombers and fighters would attack British airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. Fighter squadrons would sweep the skies, eliminating British resistance. Once air superiority was achieved, the German Navy and Army could move across the Channel with far less risk. Göring believed the campaign could be completed quickly. Within weeks, he argued, the British Air Force would collapse. If that happened, Britain itself would be exposed to relentless bombing. Ports would burn, supply routes would collapse, and civilian morale would eventually break. Under such pressure, the British government might finally accept peace.
For a moment, the plan seemed convincing, but several officers in the room remained uneasy. British defenses were stronger than many German planners had first assumed. Intelligence reports indicated that Britain possessed an advanced early warning system, radar stations positioned along the southern coast of Britain. These installations allowed the Royal Air Force to detect incoming aircraft long before they reached British territory. This meant German bombers would not arrive unnoticed. Instead, British fighters could intercept them with surprising speed and coordination. The narrow geography of the channel also worked in Britain's favor. German aircraft would be operating at the limit of their range. Pilots shot down over England would become prisoners of war. British pilots, on the other hand, could often safely parachute back onto friendly territory and return to combat within days. These factors complicated Goering's confident predictions. Still, the idea of invasion continued to evolve. Landing zones were studied along the southern coast of England, particularly between Dover and Brighton. German planners calculated tidal patterns, beach conditions, and defensive obstacles. Every scenario revealed the same truth. The invasion would require perfect coordination. Air superiority, naval protection, rapid troop deployment, continuous supply across the channel. If even one of those elements failed, the entire operation could collapse. As the discussion stretched on, the atmosphere inside the Berghof grew increasingly tense. What had started as a meeting about Britain's expected surrender was turning into a debate about one of the most difficult military operations imaginable. For Hitler, the situation was frustrating. He had hoped Britain would accept the reality of Germany's dominance in Europe. Instead, the British refusal to negotiate was forcing Germany into dangerous strategic decisions. Still, he was not ready to abandon the idea of victory. If Britain refused peace, it would have to be compelled. By the end of the meeting, one conclusion had become clear. Before any invasion could be attempted, Germany would first need to defeat Britain in the air. The skies above southern England would become the battlefield that determined everything. If the Luftwaffe succeeded, the path to invasion might open. If it failed, the English Channel would remain an impassable barrier, and the war in the West would continue far longer than Hitler had ever intended.
By the summer of 1940, the war had reached a moment of uncertainty. Germany controlled most of Western Europe, yet one nation still refused to yield. Across the narrow waters of the English Channel, Britain prepared itself for a struggle that many believed would determine the future of the entire war. Inside Germany's leadership circles, frustration was beginning to grow. Adolf Hitler had expected Britain to recognize the strategic reality after the fall of France. Instead, British leaders had chosen a different path. At the center of that decision stood one man, Winston Churchill. Churchill had become Prime Minister in May 1940, at the very moment when German armored divisions were sweeping through France. Many within the British government had considered negotiation with Germany, especially as the military situation worsened, but Churchill rejected that idea completely. In speech after speech, he made Britain's position unmistakably clear. There would be no surrender. Even after the evacuation at Dunkirk, when the British Army barely escaped destruction, Churchill framed the event not as a defeat, but as the beginning of a larger struggle. In Parliament, he declared that Britain would fight on the seas, in the air, and on its own shores if necessary. These words were not only political statements, they were intended to prepare the British population for the possibility of invasion. Throughout June and July of 1940, Britain began transforming itself into a fortress. Along the southern coastline of England, defensive preparations accelerated rapidly.
Soldiers constructed concrete bunkers overlooking beaches where German troops might land. Barbed wire stretched across coastal fields. Anti-tank obstacles were placed along roads and open terrain. Even small villages became part of the defensive network. Civilian volunteers joined local defense groups that would soon be known as the Home Guard. Many of these men were too old or too young for regular military service, yet they trained with rifles, machine guns, and improvised weapons in preparation for a possible German landing. Factories across the country worked around the clock. British industry shifted toward full wartime production. Aircraft factories increased their output of fighters, particularly the Supermarine Spitfire and the Hawker Hurricane. These aircraft would become the backbone of Britain's air defense. Pilots from across the British Empire, along with volunteers from occupied European countries, arrived to join the fight. They would soon serve together within the squadrons of the Royal Air Force. But Britain's defense relied on more than aircraft and pilots. Along the coast stood a chain of tall steel towers carrying a new technology that would play a decisive role in the coming battle. These installations were part of Britain's radar system, capable of detecting incoming aircraft long before they reached the coastline. When German bombers approached, radar operators could track their movements and report them to command centers. From there, fighter squadrons would be directed precisely toward the incoming threat. This system allowed Britain to use its limited resources with remarkable efficiency. Meanwhile, the British Navy remained a powerful shield around the island. The Royal Navy controlled the seas surrounding Britain, maintaining patrols across the Channel and the North Sea. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers stood ready to intercept any invasion fleet attempting to cross the water. German planners understood this danger posed. Slow-moving transport barges carrying invasion troops would be extremely vulnerable if British warships reached them. Even a small naval force could inflict devastating losses on an invasion convoy. Yet despite these preparations, the threat of invasion remained real. Throughout the summer, reports from occupied France described German forces gathering near channel ports. Barges were being assembled in harbors along the French and Belgian coasts. Reconnaissance flights increased over southern England. The possibility of a German landing seemed closer with each passing week. British citizens felt the tension everywhere. At night, cities prepared for air raids. Blackout curtains covered windows to prevent lights from guiding enemy bombers. Air raid sirens became a familiar sound across London and other major cities. People waited anxiously for what might come next. But instead of fear alone, a powerful sense of determination began to spread. Churchill's speeches were broadcast across the nation, reaching factories, homes, and military bases. His words emphasized that Britain was not simply defending its territory, it was standing as the final barrier against German domination of Europe. Many people understood the gravity of that moment. If Britain fell, there would be no major power left in Western Europe capable of resisting Nazi Germany. Across the Channel, German leaders continued studying invasion plans and air operations. They believed that once Britain's air defenses were destroyed, the island would become vulnerable to attack. But the British government had already accepted a different reality. The war would not end quickly. The country would fight alone if necessary, relying on its air force, its navy, and the resilience of its people. And in the skies above southern England, the first phase of that struggle was about to begin. A battle that would decide whether Germany could open the path for invasion, or whether Britain would survive to continue the war.
As the summer of 1940 continued, the reality of the situation became increasingly clear to the German leadership. The quick victories that had defined the early months of the war had created an expectation of rapid success. Poland had fallen in weeks. Norway had been secured. France, one of Europe's most powerful nations, had collapsed in just over a month.
But Britain was proving to be different. Inside the German command structure, discussions about the future of the war were becoming more serious. The assumption that Britain would eventually ask for peace had not materialized. Instead, reports from intelligence services and diplomatic channels suggested the opposite. The British government, under Winston Churchill, had no intention of negotiating. For Adolf Hitler, this created a strategic problem he had hoped to avoid. His long-term plans had always focused on the East. Germany's leadership believed that the Soviet Union would eventually become the decisive battleground of the war, but launching such a campaign required security in the West. As long as Britain remained in the war, that security did not exist. The island nation across the Channel represented more than just an enemy government. It served as a potential base for future Allied operations against German-controlled Europe. British airfields could support bombing campaigns. Its ports could receive supplies and reinforcements from across the Atlantic. And most importantly, Britain's survival meant that Germany had not truly won the war in Western Europe. During the meetings at the Berghof and in Berlin, German commanders continued analyzing the possibilities. Could Britain be defeated through air power alone? Would an invasion succeed? Or would the conflict turn into a long and uncertain struggle? The proposed invasion plan, Operation Sea Lion, remained under discussion, but even its supporters understood how dangerous such an operation would be. Germany lacked sufficient landing craft. The Navy was smaller than Britain's, and the English Channel, though narrow on a map, was a difficult and unpredictable body of water. Weather conditions could change quickly. Strong tides complicated navigation. Slow transport barges carrying soldiers and equipment would be exposed to attack. Any large-scale invasion would require total control of the air. That responsibility rested with the Luftwaffe, commanded by Hermann Göring. German aircraft would have to destroy the Royal Air Force before the army could attempt to cross the Channel. But even this objective was far from guaranteed. British radar stations, fighter coordination systems, and determined pilots created a defense network far more effective than many German planners had expected. The air war that was beginning over southern England would soon reveal how difficult it would be to break that system. Meanwhile, Britain continued strengthening its defenses. Factories increased aircraft production. New pilots joined the Air Force. Coastal defenses expanded along likely invasion routes. The Royal Navy remained ready to move against any German fleet that attempted to cross the Channel. Every week that passed made a quick German victory less certain. For Hitler, this was an uncomfortable realization. His strategy had always depended on decisive, rapid campaigns that destroyed enemies before they could fully mobilize. The longer Britain resisted, the more complicated the strategic situation became. Germany now faced the possibility of a prolonged war against an enemy that could not easily be invaded and that still possessed a powerful global empire. And beyond Britain lay another looming factor, the United States. Although not yet involved in the conflict, American economic and industrial support for Britain was slowly increasing. If the war continued long enough, Germany might eventually face a coalition far larger than it had originally anticipated. This was precisely the situation Hitler had hoped to prevent. A long war on multiple fronts was the nightmare scenario that German planners had feared since the beginning. Yet by mid-1940, that possibility was beginning to emerge. Britain had refused to surrender. Instead of collapsing after the fall of France, it had chosen to fight on alone, protected by the sea, its navy, and its air defenses. What Hitler had initially believed would be the final stage of the war in Western Europe was becoming the beginning of a new and uncertain chapter. The conflict that followed would soon be known as the Battle of Britain. It would determine whether Germany could gain control of the skies and open the path for invasion. But even beyond that immediate struggle, a larger strategic reality was forming.
As long as Britain remained undefeated, Germany could never fully secure its western flank. And without that security, any future campaign in the east would carry enormous risk. In the mountains of the Bavarian Alps, where German leaders had once expected to discuss the end of the war in the west, a different conclusion was slowly taking shape. The war was far from over. In fact, it was only beginning to expand into something much larger than anyone in that room had originally imagined.